The restaurant was one of those places my mother loved because it made her feel important. Soft gold light spilled from low chandeliers. Crystal glasses chimed every time someone laughed too loudly. Linen napkins rested on laps like badges of belonging. My sister sat at the center of the long table, shoulders back. Smile practiced soaking in the attention as if it were oxygen. I sat 2 seats away, angled slightly outward, close enough to be included, far enough to be forgettable. When my mother stood and tapped her glass, the room obeyed instantly. Conversations dissolved. Forks paused mid-air. She smiled, the smile she saved for public moments, the one that made strangers think she was generous. She raised her glass toward my sister and said she was the daughter she was proud of. Not one she loved most. Not one she admired. Proud of. The word landed clean and final. Applause rushed in to fill the space. My sister beamed. I clapped too carefully, quietly, already feeling myself disappear. Then the waiter appeared beside me. He did not ask the table. He did not hesitate. He placed a black leather folder directly in front of me. The number stared up before I could stop myself from looking. $1,980. My sister smirked. My mother did not look surprised. I pushed my chair back, stood, and the entire room went silent. For a second, everything froze. Even the music seemed to thin, like it was holding its breath. I could feel my heart in my throat, not racing, just heavy, as if it had finally dropped into the place it had been circling for years. I did not speak. I did not reach for my wallet. I simply stood there, hands resting on the back of the chair, eyes drifting over faces that suddenly looked uncomfortable. Someone cleared their throat. A cousin shifted. My father stared down at his plate like it had betrayed him. My sister tilted her head, that same small smile still there, daring me to ruin her night. My mother finally glanced my way, her eyes sharp, warning without words. "Sit down," she murmured, barely moving her lips. "Don't start anything." I sat back down slowly. The folder stayed where it was. The weight of it pressed into the table like it belonged there, like I belonged there under it. The waiter lingered, polite and unsure. "Everything okay, ma'am?" he asked, his eyes flicking between me and my mother. "We're fine," my mother said quickly. "She will take care of it." She. Always she. The sentence closed around me the way it always had. Not a request. Not even an assumption. A fact. I nodded once, not in agreement, but to end the moment. The waiter retreated. Conversation crept back in, thin and uneven, like people testing ice after a crack. My sister laughed too loudly at something an aunt said. Someone asked about dessert. Someone else mentioned traffic. The party resumed, but something had shifted. I could feel it like a draft along my spine. I stared at the leather folder and felt the familiar exhaustion settle in. Not anger yet. Not even hurt. Recognition. This was how it always went. This was how it was designed to go. My mother sat at the head of the table, back straight, perfectly composed. To anyone watching, she looked like the kind of woman who raised successful children, who kept her family together, who deserved respect. She loved these rooms, restaurants where the staff knew her name, places where her voice carried and people listened, places where her version of our family went unchallenged. My sister Lillian was glowing tonight, 32 and already used to being admired. Her hair fell just right without effort. Her dress fit like it had been tailored to her body and her ego. She accepted compliments with a practiced mix of humility and expectation. She had always been good at that, at receiving. My father sat between us, silent, shoulders slightly hunched, nursing his drink. He was present in body, absent in every way that mattered. He had mastered that over the years, being there without being involved. It was easier that way. Safer. Around us, relatives and friends filled the table, people who had watched our family from the outside for decades and believed the story my mother told. That Lillian was the star. that I was dependable, that everything balanced out in the end. No one asked if I wanted to cover the bill. No one offered to split it. No one even joked about it. It was understood. It always had been. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip, buying myself time. I could feel the old reflex waking up, the one that told me to smooth things over, to keep the peace, to handle it quietly. The reflex that had paid countless tabs, solved endless problems, and swallowed more words than I could count. But something about tonight felt different. Maybe it was the toast. Maybe it was the way my sister had looked at me when the folder landed. Or maybe it was just that I was tired. Tired in a way sleep does not fix. The waiter returned with dessert menus, setting one in front of each of us. When he reached me, he hesitated, glanced at the folder, then placed the menu beside it like an afterthought. My mother did not notice, or chose not to. Chocolate cake was mentioned. A candle was brought. Everyone sang. My sister closed her eyes, made a wish, and blew it out. Applause again. Laughter. Phones lifted for pictures. I smiled when someone aimed a camera my way, the same polite smile I had perfected years ago. The one that said I was happy to be there, that everything was fine. Inside, I was counting. Not the money, the moments, the times I had been seated just slightly out of frame. I remembered a graduation dinner years ago when Lillian announced she was moving to New York, and my mother cried with pride. I had been promoted that same week. No one asked about it. I remembered holidays where I booked the reservations, coordinated schedules, paid deposits. I remembered emergencies that somehow became my responsibility before anyone even asked. This wasn't about one birthday. It never was. Lillian leaned toward me, her voice low and sweet. "Don't be weird tonight," she said. "It's my birthday." I met her eyes. "I'm not being weird." She glanced at the folder, then back at me. "You always do this. You get quiet and dramatic." Quiet, yes. Dramatic, no. I had learned a long time ago that the loudest thing I could do was say nothing. My mother watched us now, her attention sharpened. She could sense the tension even if she pretended not to understand it. She hated scenes, especially ones she didn't control. "You're fine," she said, addressing me without looking directly at me. "We'll talk later." Later was her favorite word. Later never came. I felt something settle in my chest then. A small, steady resolve. I did not reach for the bill. I did not apologize. I did not promise anything. I simply let the moment sit there unfinished. Around us, conversation resumed more fully. Someone told a story about a trip. Someone else complained about work. The night tried to move on without my compliance, and it felt awkward without it. The waiter passed by again, slower this time, eyes lingering. I caught his gaze and gave him a small nod. Not yet. My mother sighed, a sound meant only for me. I knew that sigh. It meant disappointment. It meant pressure. It meant remember who you are in this family. I did remember. More clearly than ever. I looked around the table and saw the roles laid out like place settings. The star, the authority, the witness, the facilitator. I had been playing mine flawlessly for years. The leather folder remained untouched, patient, confident. It was not a question. It was an expectation. And for the first time, I did not feel the urge to meet it immediately. I folded my hands in my lap and took another sip of water. The room hummed with forced normalcy. My sister laughed again, a little too sharp. My father finally looked up, met my eyes for half a second, then looked away. I realized then that this family did not forget me tonight. They counted on me. By the time the coffee arrived, the restaurant had settled back into its carefully curated hum, the kind that pretends nothing ever went wrong. Plates were cleared. Dessert forks clinked. Lillian was opening cards, laughing on cue, soaking in praise like it was owed. The leather folder stayed in front of me closed now as if the problem had been solved simply by not touching it. I sat with my hands folded, posture straight, eyes soft. From the outside I must have looked composed, agreeable, exactly what everyone expected. Inside something quieter and heavier was happening. I wasn't deciding whether to pay. I was deciding whether to keep playing the part that had been assigned to me long before I could name it. The discomfort around the table faded faster than I expected. People are good at adapting when the alternative threatens their comfort. An aunt leaned over to admire Lillian's earrings. A cousin asked about vacation plans. Someone joked about calories and cake. The night smoothed itself over me like it always had, assuming I would absorb the rest. I watched how easily they moved on and understood something that felt both obvious and new. My silence was familiar to them. Their unease was not. I had never been told what my role was. No one sat me down and explained it. It was enforced through repetition, through small expectations that grew into certainties. I was the one who handled things, the one who didn't make a fuss, the one who could be counted on. Those words were offered like compliments, but they came with conditions. Lillian caught my eye and lifted her glass, smiling as if to say, "See, everything is fine." My mother nodded once in my direction, approval flickering across her face. Good. Back in line. I had learned that nod early. Learned what it meant to earn it and what happened when I didn't. The first time I remember being corrected for something that wasn't mine to fix, I was 7. Lillian had forgotten her lunch at home, and my mother discovered it halfway to school. She pulled over, turned around, and drove back jaw tight. When we arrived late, my mother knelt in front of Lillian, brushed hair from her face, and told her it was okay. Everyone forgets sometimes. Then she looked at me and asked why I hadn't reminded my sister. I remember the confusion more than the shame. I hadn't packed the lunch. I hadn't forgotten it. But I apologized anyway. That was the lesson. Responsibility wasn't about action, it was about proximity. As we grew older, the pattern sharpened. Lillian was forgiven for impulse. I was corrected for oversight. She was encouraged to explore. I was encouraged to be practical. When money came up, the language changed depending on who needed it. Lillian's expenses were investments. Mine were choices. In high school, when she wanted to switch extracurriculars halfway through the year, my parents paid the fees without complaint. When I asked for help with a test prep course, my mother suggested the free study guide at the library. "You're resourceful," she said, like it was praise. "You'll figure it out." I did figure it out. Over and over again. I figured out how to earn, how to budget, how to adjust expectations so disappointment wouldn't knock the wind out of me. By the time we were adults, the arrangement felt settled, almost elegant in its imbalance. I was strong. Lillian was special. At the table, my mother leaned toward me as coffee was poured. "We'll settle up at the end," she said quietly. No need to make it awkward. There it was. The language of control softened into concern. Not "Are you okay with this?" Not "Can we talk later?" "We'll settle up." As if the outcome were already agreed upon. I nodded again, not because I agreed, but because I wasn't ready to open my mouth yet. The truth was, I didn't trust myself to speak without years of swallowed words spilling out. I had learned that when you're labeled reasonable, any emotion becomes evidence against you. The label followed me everywhere. At family gatherings, people would say things like, "You've always been the mature one," or "We don't worry about you." They meant it kindly. They didn't see the trap in it. Maturity in my family meant endurance. It meant picking up slack without acknowledgement. It meant being reliable even when it hurt. The worst part was how it was framed as love. Helping your sister, supporting your parents, doing the right thing. Those phrases carried weight, and they worked because I believed them. Because I did love my family. Because I wanted to believe that my effort mattered. What I was only beginning to see was how rarely it was asked for. It was expected. After dinner outside under the soft glow of the restaurant's sign, hugs were exchanged. Lillian wrapped her arms around me, her perfume sharp and sweet. "Thank you for coming," she said. Her tone suggested generosity, as if my presence had been optional. "Happy birthday," I said. It was true. I was glad she existed. That had never been the problem. My father squeezed my shoulder. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said the way he always did when he didn't intend to. On the drive home, the city lights blurred past my windshield. I didn't turn on the radio. I wanted to hear my own thoughts, even if they were uncomfortable. The image of the folder on the table replayed in my mind not as an insult, but as confirmation. This was not new. It was simply visible. At home, I kicked off my shoes, set my bag down, and stood in the quiet of my living room. No one needed anything from me here. No one was waiting for me to fix something. The silence felt unfamiliar, like stepping into a room after a loud party ends. I poured a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table. I didn't open my laptop. I didn't check messages. I let the evening settle into me. I thought about how many times I had paid without question. How often I had covered costs because it was easier than explaining why I shouldn't. How many conversations I had avoided because peace felt safer than honesty. And how each time the expectation grew. Helping became habit. Habit became obligation. There was a part of me that wanted to justify it all. To say that families are complicated, that no one is perfect, that intentions matter. All of that was still true, but it was also true that intentions didn't erase impact. The realization didn't make me angry, it made me clear. I thought about what would happen if I didn't step in the next time, the discomfort, the confusion, the way people might look at me differently, the fear of being called selfish or difficult. Those labels hovered at the edge of my thoughts, familiar and sharp. I also thought about the cost of continuing, the quiet resentment, the way my needs had learned to whisper, the exhaustion of always being the adult in the room. I finished my water and set the glass in the sink. Tomorrow the bill would resurface. It always did. Someone would mention it casually. Someone would assume I'd already taken care of it. The pattern would try to reassert itself. I wasn't ready to break it yet. Not out loud. Not dramatically. But I felt something shift inside me, small and steady. I wasn't going to rush to make it comfortable for them anymore. I went to bed without setting an alarm, knowing sleep might be light. As I lay there in the dark, I made a quiet promise to myself. Not a declaration, not a threat, just an understanding. I would stop absorbing responsibility simply because it was handed to me. I would start noticing when help became expectation. And before I paid anything again in money or in silence, I would make sure I understood exactly what I was being asked to carry. The bill could wait. Morning came without relief. The kind of light that usually softened my kitchen felt too honest, too bright, like it was asking questions I wasn't ready to answer. I made coffee and stood by the counter while it brewed, listening to the familiar gurgle, waiting for my nerves to settle. They didn't. The image from the night before kept replaying, not the toast or the applause, but the moment the folder landed in front of me. Not as a surprise, as placement. Someone had decided where it belonged long before the waiter ever walked over. I sat at the table with my mug and let the thought finish forming. That bill hadn't been spontaneous. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been counted on. My phone buzzed while I was still staring into my coffee. A text from my mother. "Morning. We should talk later about last night." No apology. No question. Just the assumption that I would be available, that I would help clean up the edges. I didn't respond right away. I told myself I was busy, that I needed time, but the truth was simpler. I wanted to see what would happen if I didn't rush to reassure her. The quiet stretched. I let it. By the afternoon, the night had rearranged itself in my memory, lining up with other moments I had tried not to examine too closely. Times when money moved from me to them without discussion. Times when I had been thanked after the fact, if at all. Times when something urgent appeared and somehow landed in my lap. I opened my laptop and pulled up my bank statements, telling myself I was just curious, just checking. The rational part of me insisted this was unnecessary, that families help each other, that generosity isn't meant to be tracked. That voice had kept me comfortable for years. Still, I scrolled. There were the obvious things: a few restaurant tabs, a hotel deposit for a family trip that never quite included me, an emergency repair for Lillian's car that my father had asked me to handle because he was tied up. Each one came with a memory, a reason, a justification that had made sense at the time. Then there were the things I hadn't thought about in years. A transfer labeled temporary that was never returned. A payment I had made directly to a vendor because it was easier than waiting. A charge for a service I didn't use but had been told would benefit all of us. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my eyes. None of this was criminal. None of it was dramatic. That was the problem. It was quiet, cumulative, easy to dismiss as coincidence. My phone buzzed again. This time it was Lillian. About last night, she wrote. Can we not make it a thing? Mom was really upset. There it was. The shift. Not are you okay? Not did that feel fair? Just don't disrupt the story. I set the phone face down and stood up, pacing the length of my living room. I wasn't angry at Lillian. Not yet. Anger would have been simpler. I was trying to understand the shape of something I had lived inside for decades. I went back to the table and opened my email. I typed my own name into the search bar, something I had never thought to do before. The results surprised me. Threads I had skimmed or ignored. Attachments I had opened without really reading because they came from family, and family meant trust. One subject line caught my eye. Follow-up documentation. I clicked. The email was old, years old, from an address I vaguely recognized but couldn't place. The body was short, professional, thanking me for my prompt response and attaching revised paperwork. I had no memory of responding. No memory of paperwork. My pulse quickened, not with panic, but with focus. I opened the attachment. At first glance, it looked like legal language, dense and dull, the kind of thing people sign without reading because someone else already has. My name appeared near the top. Not in a casual way, in a way that suggested responsibility. I read it again, slower. My name was listed under a section that described obligations. Not help. Not support. Obligations. I sat very still. The room felt smaller, quieter. I noticed the sound of my refrigerator kicking on the hum of the building outside. Everything ordinary, everything unchanged, while something inside me shifted into a sharper alignment. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't spiral. I read the document again, line by line, letting the language settle. I wasn't an expert, but I understood enough to know this wasn't nothing. This wasn't a favor. I thought back to when that email would have arrived. I had been in the middle of a hectic work period. My father had mentioned needing something signed, something minor, nothing to worry about. I remembered saying, okay, send it over. I remembered trusting him. Trust had filled in the blanks. I closed the document and stared at my screen. A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it. Another part wanted to cry for the version of myself who had believed that being dependable meant being protected. I searched the sender's name online and found a sparse profile. A consultant. A partner. Someone tied loosely to my family's business, the one they talked about in broad strokes but never details. The realization landed quietly and heavily. This wasn't just about dinners and deposits. This was structural. My phone rang. My father's name lit up the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Hey, kiddo. He said, his voice careful, friendly. Your mom mentioned you seemed off last night. I'm fine, I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Good, good. Listen about the bill. We'll figure it out. No need to stress. I didn't mention the document. I didn't ask questions. Not yet. Instead, I listened to how quickly he moved past it, how easily he assumed resolution without discussion. After we hung up, I sat back down and opened a new folder on my desktop. I named it neutrally, nothing that would catch the eye. Inside, I saved the document. I wasn't accusing anyone. I wasn't planning a confrontation. I was gathering facts, something I had always been good at. The difference now was that I was doing it for myself. Over the next few hours, I cross-checked what I could. Public records, company filings, anything that might connect the dots without alerting anyone that I was looking. The picture that emerged wasn't dramatic, but it was clear enough to make my stomach tighten. My name appeared where risk lived. Not prominently, not proudly. Quietly in the background, absorbing weight. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The memory of the folder on the table returned sharper now. It wasn't just a bill. It was a reminder of where they were comfortable placing responsibility. It was proof that the pattern extended beyond family dinners. I thought about how often I had been told I was capable. How often that capability had been used as justification. You can handle it. You're good with details. You're not emotional about money. I had believed those things were compliments. I was beginning to see them as positioning. The doorbell rang, startling me. A delivery. Life continuing. I signed, thanked the driver, and closed the door again, suddenly aware of how insulated my investigation was from the world outside. No one else knew what I was seeing. No one was expecting me to look. That realization brought an unexpected calm. I sent a message to a colleague I trusted, someone who had navigated complex contracts before. I kept it vague. A hypothetical question. Does this language suggest liability to you? The response came back quicker than I expected. Yes. Enough that I would ask for clarification before agreeing to anything. I stared at the screen, letting the answer settle. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't being dramatic. This deserved attention. I returned to the document and read it one more time, slower than before. The language hadn't changed, but my understanding had. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a structure that relied on my silence. I thought about how many times I had been told not to worry, that everything was under control. How often I had accepted that because worrying felt like disloyalty. I understood now why questions were discouraged, why details were glossed over, why I was always asked to help but never invited to decide. The weight in my chest shifted again, not heavier, but more defined. I knew something now that I hadn't known before, and that knowledge couldn't be put back. As evening approached, my mother texted again. "Can we talk tonight?" I typed a response, then erased it. I wasn't ready to talk. Not without understanding the full scope of what I was carrying. I closed my laptop and stood by the window, watching the sky darken. The city lights flickered on one by one, steady and indifferent. Somewhere my family was moving through their evening, probably assuming I would handle things the way I always had. I thought about the bill, about the document, about the way those two moments lined up like bookends. For the first time, I allowed myself to think the thought all the way through. This debt was never mine. Not financially, not emotionally, not legally. I went back to the table and opened the folder again, adding notes, organizing what I had found. Not to accuse, not to threaten, to prepare. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know who would deny what or how loudly. But I knew one thing with clarity that felt almost peaceful. Before I paid another cent, before I smoothed over another mess, I would know exactly what I was being asked to cover. And once I knew, I would decide whether I was willing to carry it. I closed the folder and shut my laptop, the room falling quiet again. The night felt different now, not heavier, but sharper, like a line had been drawn. I turned off the lights and let the pause hold, knowing the next move wouldn't belong to them alone. Once I started looking at the edges, the center revealed itself without effort. What I had thought of as family tension, uneven affection, awkward expectations, all of it sat on top of something sturdier and far less emotional. Money, structure, protection. Not love gone wrong, but systems built to work quietly. My family's business had always existed in conversation more than detail. It was something my mother referenced with pride when talking to friends, something my sister alluded to when describing her future, something my father waved off with a vague, "It's complicated," whenever I asked. It lived in that comfortable fog where success is implied and questions feel rude. At holidays, someone would ask how the business was doing, and my mother would smile and say busy, which in her vocabulary meant thriving. My sister would nod, adding that she was learning so much that she loved being involved. I would sip my drink and listen, aware that the conversation always shifted when I leaned in too closely. It had never bothered me before. I had my own career, my own life. Or at least, that's what I told myself. But now, with the document fresh in my mind, those half-conversations took on a sharper shape. I opened my laptop again and typed the business name into the search bar, something I realized I had never done. Public information surfaced easily. A registered entity. A few filings. Nothing scandalous. Nothing that screamed trouble. But as I clicked through, I noticed patterns. Names that repeated. Titles that overlapped. Structures that placed responsibility in specific places. My sister's name appeared in marketing language, brand-facing, outreach, vision. My mother's name appeared in leadership roles, oversight, direction, authority. And then there was a name I didn't recognize tucked into the administrative layer. Not flashy, not celebrated, consistent. I sat back and tried to remember if I had ever been introduced to him. I couldn't recall a face, a handshake, even a passing mention. Yet his name appeared more often than I expected, attached to documents that carried weight. The realization settled slowly. Someone else was steering from behind the curtain. Later that week, my mother invited me over for coffee. Her house was immaculate as always, the kind of clean that suggested effort and control rather than comfort. She poured coffee, set out pastries, and smiled as if we were catching up, not circling an unspoken conflict. I waited for her to start. She always preferred to frame the conversation. "About the other night," she said, stirring her cup though the coffee had long settled. "I hope you understand we didn't mean anything by it." I nodded, non-committal. I was still learning how to listen without volunteering reassurance. "Your sister was the focus," she continued. "It was her birthday. These things happen." Things like that do not just happen, I thought. But I didn't say it. She watched me carefully, eyes flicking to my face for cues. "You've always been so understanding," she added. "That's one of your strengths." There it was again. The compliment that came with a leash. I took a sip of coffee and let the silence stretch. My mother shifted slightly, unused to not being met halfway. "I've been thinking about the business," I said, finally keeping my tone even. "How it's structured." Her hand paused midair. Just for a fraction of a second, but enough. "Why now?" I shrugged. "Curiosity." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "There's nothing for you to worry about. It's all handled." "By who?" I asked. Her smile tightened. "Your father and I. And Lillian is learning. It's important to keep it in the family." I nodded, letting her answer sit as it was. Partial? Defensive? After I left, the fog around the business felt intentional. I replayed the conversation in my head, not focusing on what she said, but what she avoided. Details. Names. Clarity. That evening, I called Lillian. Not to accuse. To listen. She answered on the third ring, distracted. I could hear movement in the background, her voice layered with something performative. "Busy night," she said. What's up? I asked her how involved she was in the business now. She laughed lightly. It's complicated. Mom handles the boring stuff. I'm more vision. Strategy. Who handles the rest? I asked. There was a pause. Then she said a name casually, as if it should mean something to me. He helps. He's always been around. Always is. A long time. I didn't push. I thanked her and hung up my chest tight, not with fear, but with confirmation. Back at home, I spread out what I had found so far. Nothing illegal. Nothing explosive. Just enough alignment to make the picture clearer. I had not been excluded because I lacked interest or ability. I had been excluded because my role was elsewhere. Support. Shield. Backstop. The thought stung less than I expected. Maybe because it fit too well. It explained the careful distance. The way questions were deflected. The way responsibility flowed in one direction. I remembered times I had offered ideas, suggestions, insights, only to be told that wasn't my lane. You have enough on your plate. Let us handle this. You wouldn't enjoy it. I had believed them. Now I saw the benefit of keeping me just informed enough to comply, just distant enough to not interfere. I began following the paper trail more intentionally. Public records industry mentions anything that could be accessed without raising suspicion. I wasn't hacking or snooping. I was observing what was already visible, what had simply never been pointed out to me. The more I looked, the clearer it became that risk and responsibility were carefully placed, not with the people who enjoyed the credit, with the ones who wouldn't ask questions. I thought again of the document with my name on it, of the language, of the timing. How many similar documents might exist signed without pause because someone I trusted told me it was fine? A message popped up on my phone from my mother. We should all get together soon, she wrote. Talk things through. Talk things through meant reset the narrative. I didn't respond. Instead, I made myself dinner and ate at the counter, the hum of the refrigerator steady and grounding. I wasn't spiraling. I wasn't plotting. I was learning. And learning required quiet. The next day, I pulled up more filings and noticed something that made my breath catch. A structure that shifted liability in subtle ways. Not obvious unless you knew where to look. Not illegal. Just convenient. Convenient for them. I closed my laptop and stared out the window, the city moving on without me. Cars passed. People walked dogs. Somewhere my family was going about their day, assuming I would show up when needed, sign, when asked, pay, when required. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was sobering. I had always thought my value in the family came from being loved, even if unevenly. Now I saw that my value had been operational. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Anger would have made this simple. I felt something closer to resolve, calm and heavy, like setting down a weight you didn't realize you were holding. When my phone rang that evening and my father's name appeared again, I let it go to voicemail. His message was gentle, careful, asking me to call him back. I listened without responding. I wasn't ready to ask questions out loud. Questions change dynamics. They alert. They provoke defense. For now, I needed clarity, not confrontation. I organized my notes, labeling dates, names, connections. Not obsessively, methodically. This was not about catching anyone. It was about understanding the structure I was standing inside. As I closed my laptop for the night, one thought settled with quiet certainty. I had not been kept out because I was weak. I had been kept out because I was useful somewhere else. That understanding didn't harden me. It steadied me. I turned off the lights and went to bed, not knowing exactly what I would do next, but knowing I would not step blindly again. The smiles, the reassurances, the familiar roles, they all looked different now. And I was no longer willing to pretend I didn't see it. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was anxious in the way people imagine anxiety, pacing and spiraling, but because my mind had shifted into a different mode: alert, sorting, quietly replaying years of moments with new captions. By morning, I knew I couldn't unsee what I had already seen. Suspicion had hardened into intent. I wasn't looking for reassurance anymore. I was looking for proof. I waited until the apartment was completely still, until the sounds of the building settled into their usual rhythm. Then I made tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened the drawer where I kept things I rarely touched: old folders, backup drives, a small stack of envelopes I had never bothered to throw away because they might matter someday. Trust has a way of making people careless. Not sloppy, just unguarded. I had never thought to comb through old emails with the assumption that something was wrong. Family had always been the safe category. You skimmed, you signed, you helped. You moved on. Now I moved slowly. I started with email, not searching for keywords yet, just scrolling back through years, watching patterns emerge. Requests that had come framed as favors, attachments sent late at night with quick follow-up messages that said, "Sorry for the rush, we need this tonight." Threads where I had replied with a simple "okay" or "no problem" or "sent." It startled me how many times my name appeared in correspondence that had nothing to do with my life. Payments, confirmations, acknowledgments, things that assumed my involvement as a given. I wasn't angry yet. Anger would have blurred the edges. I felt something closer to grief, not for what I had lost, but for what I had misunderstood. When I moved on to physical files, it felt almost ceremonial. I spread papers across the table, aligning them by date, smoothing creases, reading margins I had never bothered to read before. Notes written in familiar handwriting that once felt reassuring now felt strategic. Then I found it. It was tucked between two unrelated documents, folded once thin enough to disappear if you weren't looking for it. A draft agreement. Not final, but close enough to matter. My name printed cleanly near the top, followed by language that did not leave much room for interpretation. I stopped breathing without meaning to. The room went very quiet. I read it once, then again, slower. It wasn't dramatic. No bold warnings or aggressive terms. Just careful wording that placed responsibility in my lap with a politeness that felt almost cruel. I traced the lines with my finger, grounding myself in the physical reality of it. This wasn't imagination. This wasn't me overthinking. This was a document that existed, that had been prepared, that assumed my consent. I thought back to the time frame when this would have been created. I remembered my father mentioning paperwork, something administrative, nothing to worry about. I remembered being busy, tired, trusting. I remembered signing something electronically without opening the attachment fully because the message said it was standard. Standard. The word echoed in my head. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight settle. The realization was sharp, but oddly clean. This was not an accident. Accidents don't repeat themselves this neatly. The worst part wasn't the document itself. It was how well it fit. How it aligned with every moment I had been told not to concern myself with details. How it explained the careful distance, the vague answers, the way responsibility had always flowed toward me without explanation. I wanted briefly to believe it was outdated, that it had never been executed, that someone had thought better of it, that my trust had been misplaced, but not exploited. So I checked. I searched for related references, dates, follow-ups, and there they were, mentions in emails, language that assumed the agreement existed, conversations that referenced obligations without naming them directly. My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with clarity. I had been placed where risk lived. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath, reminding myself to stay steady. Panic wouldn't help. Rage wouldn't help. Understanding would. I picked up my phone and considered calling my mother, then set it back down. Confrontation without preparation would only teach them to hide better. If I had learned anything from my place in this family, it was that speaking too soon cost leverage. Instead, I opened a notebook and began writing things down. Dates, names, connections. Not accusatory notes, just facts. I wasn't building a case. I was building a map. As I wrote, memories rearranged themselves. The times I had been excluded from meetings because it would be boring. The times I had been asked to sign something quickly because everyone else was waiting. The times I had been reassured that everything was handled. Handled by whom? I stopped and stared at the page, my hand resting on the pen. There was a strange calm in seeing it laid out. Not relief, not satisfaction, just orientation. I had been standing in the wrong place, facing the wrong direction. The urge to confront flared suddenly hot and tempting. I imagined calling a family meeting, laying the document on the table, demanding explanations. I imagined the shock on their faces, the scramble to reframe the apologies that might come wrapped in justification. I let the urge pass, because I knew how those conversations went. Emotion would flood the room. Guilt would be weaponized. I would be asked to understand intentions instead of outcomes, to forgive before accountability ever entered the room. I wasn't ready to give that away yet. Instead, I scanned the document and saved a digital copy in a new folder. I named it plainly. No drama, just facts. Then I cross-checked. Public records? Anything that could confirm or contextualize what I was seeing. And slowly, carefully, the picture sharpened. This document was not isolated. It was part of a structure that relied on me being uninformed but compliant. Containment, not neglect. That realization stung more than I expected. It reframed every moment I had felt overlooked. I had not been forgotten. I had been managed. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from my sister. "Mom says you're being distant. Everything okay?" I stared at the screen for a long moment before typing a response. "I'm fine. Just busy." Busy had always been my shield. It was believable. It asked for nothing. I set the phone down and returned to my notes, adding one last line. Bill at birthday dinner. Not emotional, procedural. Because now I understood. That bill hadn't been about celebration or generosity. It had been consistent with a system that assumed I would absorb cost without question. I leaned back and laughed softly, the sound surprising me. Not because it was funny, but because the pattern was so clear it bordered on absurd. Years of conditioning distilled into a single, expensive moment. As evening approached, I cleaned the table, stacked the papers, and slid them into the folder. I wasn't hiding them. I was organizing them. There was a knock at my door, a neighbor returning a package she'd picked up earlier. We exchanged pleasantries. She smiled, unaware that anything in my world had shifted. Life has a way of continuing even as your internal architecture rearranges itself. After she left, I stood by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on. Somewhere across the city, my family was probably assuming I would come around, that this would smooth over, that I would do what I always did. They had no idea that the ground under their assumptions had already moved. I thought about what came next, not in terms of revenge or justice, but protection. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider that loving my family did not require sacrificing myself. That loyalty did not mean silence. That being responsible did not mean being expendable. I closed the folder and placed it in a drawer, not out of fear, but because I didn't need to stare at it anymore. The knowledge was mine now. It wasn't going anywhere. As I turned off the lights and prepared for bed, one thought stayed with me, steady and grounding. This had never been about favoritism alone. It had been about positioning risk away from those who demanded praise and toward the one they trusted not to push back. I lay down the room dark and quiet and felt something settle into place. Not anger, not resolve, readiness. I didn't know yet how or when I would speak. I only knew that when I did, I would not be asking for permission. And for the first time in my life, that felt like freedom. The next few days passed with an unfamiliar steadiness. I wasn't braced for impact anymore. I wasn't replaying conversations or drafting speeches in my head. The discovery had done something unexpected. It had quieted the part of me that kept asking for fairness like it was a favor someone might grant if I asked nicely enough. I stopped asking. Not out loud, not internally. The question itself no longer made sense. Fairness had never been part of the design. Once I accepted that the noise fell away, I went to work, answered emails, met deadlines. From the outside, nothing about my life looked different. Inside, everything had shifted into alignment. I wasn't angry. Anger would have made this personal. I was clear. For years, I had worn the labels my family gave me as if they were earned titles. Reliable, level-headed, the one who could handle things. I had mistaken those words for appreciation instead of instruction. Now I examined them more carefully. Reliable meant available. Level-headed meant quiet. Able to handle things meant willing to absorb consequences that weren't mine. It was strange how quickly those definitions snapped into focus once I stopped trying to defend them. I thought about all the times I had been praised for being reasonable, especially in moments when reasonableness cost me something. I remembered being told I was easier than my sister, as if ease were a virtue instead of a warning sign. I remembered the satisfaction I felt when conflict dissolved because I stepped in, smoothed over, paid, explained. That satisfaction had been temporary. The cost had not. The real cost had been cumulative. Not just money, though that mattered. It was the erosion of my own instincts, the way I had learned to second-guess discomfort, to interpret unease as immaturity, to believe that asking for more clarity made me difficult. I saw now how being reasonable had kept the system intact, how my silence had preserved appearances, how peace in my family had always required my participation. That realization could have hardened me. Instead, it sharpened me. I made an appointment to talk with someone I trusted professionally, not to lay out the whole story, but to test my understanding. I framed it neutrally, a hypothetical situation, facts, without emotion. When I finished explaining, there was a pause on the other end of the line. "That's not nothing," she said carefully. "If your name is attached like that, you should be very cautious about what you sign or agree to going forward." I thanked her and hung up, feeling something settle. Validation without drama, confirmation without judgment. It strengthened my resolve in a way confrontation never could. I didn't share this conversation with anyone in my family. I didn't hint that I was seeking outside perspective. I didn't ask questions designed to provoke reassurance. I shifted instead into observation. It was easier than I expected. When my mother called, her tone was light, almost cheerful, as if nothing had happened. She talked about an upcoming event, mentioned logistics, floated ideas. I listened without interrupting, noting how quickly the conversation turned toward what would be needed and who would handle it. Normally, I would have jumped in, offered to coordinate, asked what she wanted me to do. This time I responded with non-committal sounds, gentle acknowledgments, nothing that anchored responsibility to me. There was a pause she didn't quite know how to fill. "We'll figure it out," she said, finally sounding slightly uncertain. I let the words stand. With my sister, the shift was more subtle. She sent messages that assumed my involvement without stating it outright. "Can you look at this when you have a minute? I might need help with something." The language was casual, practice designed to slide past resistance. I replied later than usual. I kept my responses brief. Not unkind, just contained. Each time I felt the old reflex flare, the urge to be useful, to prove my worth. I noticed it, acknowledged it, and let it pass. This was what it felt like to set boundaries without announcing them. Uncomfortable, quiet, effective. I started paying attention to the skills I had always downplayed: organization, pattern recognition, emotional regulation. I had treated them as survival tools, not strengths. In this context, they became something else entirely: dangerous if used deliberately. My family continued as they always had, unaware that the ground under their expectations was no longer solid. They mistook my calm for compliance, my silence for agreement. Familiarity made them careless. At a family gathering later that week, I watched the dynamics play out with new eyes. The way my mother directed conversation, the way my sister occupied space, the way my father hovered on the edges, avoiding friction. Nothing had changed. That was the point. An aunt commented on how dependable I was, how lucky my parents were to have me. I smiled politely, feeling the words slide off me. Praise without equity no longer held the same power. At one point, my mother leaned in and asked if I could help with something later, her voice low, already assuming the answer. I met her eyes and said, "Maybe I'll let you know." She blinked, surprised. Just for a second. That moment told me everything I needed to know. Later that night, alone again in my apartment, I reflected on how different this felt from confrontation. There was no adrenaline, no satisfaction, just a steady sense of control returning to places I hadn't realized were empty. I wasn't plotting. I wasn't rehearsing speeches. I was preparing by not giving myself away prematurely. I knew there would be consequences. There always are when you step out of a role people depend on. Approval would thin. Affection might cool. Stories might shift. I grieved that quietly without drama, not because I didn't care, but because grief didn't need an audience. I understood now that asking for fairness had kept me in negotiation with a system that never intended to change. Stopping that negotiation felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of shifting sand. I closed my notebook where I had been tracking observations and sat back, breathing evenly. The future wasn't clear yet. There were still pieces I didn't understand, still layers I needed to uncover. But one thing was certain. I would not ask permission to protect myself. I would not explain myself before I understood the full landscape. I would not rush to restore comfort at my own expense. They had taught me to carry weight without complaint. Now I would decide where it landed. I closed the folder and set it aside, not because I was done, but because I was ready. The next steps would require patience, timing, restraint. And for the first time, I trusted myself to choose all three. I didn't wake up one morning with a plan. There was no dramatic shift, no surge of adrenaline that told me now is the moment. What changed was quieter than that. I stopped reacting and started noticing. And once I noticed, design came naturally. Power doesn't announce itself when it's learning, it watches. My family relaxed in my silence. That part surprised me less than it should have. Within days of my softened responses and delayed replies, the tension they'd briefly sensed evaporated. My mother's voice on the phone regained its familiar rhythm. My sister's messages returned to their casual entitlement. The system corrected itself, assuming the anomaly had passed. They mistook my restraint for surrender. At dinner one night, my mother talked through plans for an upcoming business event, something formal enough to matter, something that would bring together partners, advisors, extended family. She spoke with authority, outlining roles, expectations, who would be there, and what would be needed. I listened, nodding, occasionally asking neutral questions. Nothing that challenged her control. Nothing that flagged resistance. The old version of me would have offered help by the second sentence. This version waited. At one point, she said, "We'll probably need you involved. You're always so good with details." I smiled and said, "We'll see how the schedule looks." The table went quiet for half a second. Not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to register it. My sister glanced up, eyebrows knitting briefly, then smoothed her expression. They didn't push. Not yet. That was when I understood something essential. Familiarity had trained them to assume access. They didn't prepare for resistance because they'd never needed to. I leaned into that assumption deliberately. Over the next week, I played my role carefully. I answered messages. I showed up to family gatherings. I listened. I offered small, harmless assistance where it cost me nothing, enough to keep the picture intact. Camouflage, not compliance. The emotional distance helped. When you stop seeking approval, observation becomes easier. I noticed patterns I had always felt but never named. The way my mother spoke in directives disguised as suggestions. The way my sister filled silence with confidence. The way decisions were framed as inevitable before anyone could object. I noted dates, timelines, who deferred to whom, where hesitation appeared and where it didn't. And slowly, quietly, I began collecting. Not documents in the dramatic sense, not hidden files or stolen records. Just information that already existed gathered patiently. Emails that revealed expectations, conversations that assumed my consent, language that placed responsibility without acknowledgement. Each detail fit neatly into the picture I'd already begun to see. Then came the variable. I didn't announce it. I didn't explain it. I simply delayed. When my sister asked me to review something urgent, I said I couldn't get to it until later in the week. When my mother hinted that she'd need me to handle a piece of the upcoming event, I said I'd confirm once I knew more. Nothing explosive, nothing confrontational. Just enough friction to test the structure. The response was subtle, but immediate. Follow-up messages came faster. Tone shifted from casual to concerned. My mother called instead of texting, her voice light but insistent. My sister checked in twice in one afternoon. I watched it all with a strange sense of calm. This wasn't personal. It was mechanical. The system was registering resistance and trying to correct it. At no point did anyone ask if I was okay. They asked if I was available. That distinction mattered. The event loomed closer. Invitations went out. Schedules were finalized. The closer it came, the more visible the pressure became. This wasn't just a dinner or a meeting. It was a moment where appearances mattered. Where signatures, confirmations, verbal support would be witnessed. Leverage lives and visibility. I spent evenings organizing what I had already gathered, not obsessively but thoroughly. Dates aligned, language repeated, assumptions stacked. I didn't prepare accusations. I prepared questions. Questions change rooms. There were moments alone in my apartment when the temptation to reveal everything rose sharply. To confront my mother, to demand explanations, to force the truth into the open. Those moments passed as quickly as they came. I had lived long enough inside this family to know that premature truth would be reframed as betrayal. That emotion would drown facts. That control would tighten. Timing mattered more than outrage. The closer the event came, the more confident they became. My silence reassured them. My presence soothed them. My sister joked about how glad she was that I was involved, how she didn't know what they'd do without me. I smiled and said nothing. In one conversation, my mother said almost fondly, "You always come through. I don't worry when you're involved." I felt the old pull in that sentence the way it had once felt like belonging. Now it sounded like dependence, and dependence when unexamined becomes arrogance. The night before the event, I sat at my desk and reviewed everything one last time. Not with nerves, not with anticipation, with readiness. I wasn't planning a scene. I wasn't planning revenge. I was positioning myself so that when the moment arrived, I would not be rushed, cornered, or silenced. They thought I was holding the bill. They didn't realize I was holding the timing. I set my alarm, turned off the light, and went to bed with a steady heartbeat. Tomorrow would not be explosive. It would be precise. And precision, I had learned, was far more unsettling than anger. As sleep finally came, one thought settled clearly in my mind. The board was set. All that remained was to wait for them to make the next move. The morning arrived with a clarity that surprised me. No dread, no rehearsed speeches, just a quiet awareness that this day had been moving toward me for a long time. I dressed carefully, not to impress, but to feel anchored. Comfortable shoes, Neutral colors, nothing that would distract or invite comment. I wanted my presence to be steady, unremarkable, easy to overlook. The venue was a downtown conference space attached to a hotel my mother liked because it looked important without being flashy. Glass doors, polished floors, low voices echoing softly against stone. People in suits moved with purpose, clipboards tucked under arms, lanyards swinging. The air smelled faintly of coffee and carpet cleaner. My family arrived together, a practiced unit. My mother led chin-lifted, greeting people by name. My sister followed half a step behind, smiling brightly, hair perfectly styled, already scanning the room for recognition. My father brought up the rear, hands in his pockets, eyes drifting. I walked with them, but not inside them, close enough to belong, far enough to observe. The room filled quickly. Advisors, partners, a few extended family members who had been invited more for optics than contribution. Conversations overlapped, polite and contained. I noted who spoke with confidence and who deferred, who listened, who waited for cues. My mother found me near the back and touched my arm lightly. "We might need you later," she said, voice low and calm, as if discussing seating arrangements. I nodded without committing. The program began. Introductions. A brief overview of progress and plans. My sister was praised for her involvement, her vision, her energy. She accepted the compliments easily, as if they were currency she was used to handling. As the agenda moved forward, the requests became more specific. Documents were passed, timelines discussed. At one point, a consultant asked for confirmation on a particular item, something procedural but important. My mother answered smoothly, then glanced toward me. "You can handle that, right?" she said, not as a question, but a bridge. I felt the familiar eyes shift in my direction. Not curious exactly, expectant. I took a breath and said I'd like to review it before confirming. The words landed softly but changed the temperature of the room. Just enough. The consultant nodded, unbothered. "Of course. We can circle back." My mother's smile held, but her eyes sharpened. "We're on a bit of a timeline," she said. "I understand," I replied. "I just want to be clear." Clear was a dangerous word in this space. The meeting continued, but something had shifted. My family grew more alert. My sister stopped smiling quite as easily. My father leaned forward, suddenly attentive. Later, during a break, my mother pulled me aside near the coffee station. Her voice dropped, controlled, but tight. "Is there a problem?" I kept my tone neutral. "I just need more information before I agree to anything." She studied my face, searching for emotion, for weakness, for reassurance. "You trust us, don't you?" The question was framed as concern. The implication was warning. I looked at her and said, "I trust facts." Her mouth tightened. "This isn't the time to complicate things." I met her gaze. "Then maybe it's the right time." She stepped back, startled, just for a moment. Then she straightened and said, "We'll talk later," as if that closed the subject. The break ended. We returned to our seats. As the session resumed, the requests became more pointed. Clarifications were asked for. Confirmations needed. Each time my family angled toward me, expecting me to smooth the path. Each time I slowed it down. Not refusing, not accusing, just asking to understand. The room noticed. Professionals are trained to sense hesitation. It means risk. It means something needs attention. Their questions grew more precise, their notes more detailed. My sister leaned toward me at one point, whispering through a tight smile, "You're making this weird." I didn't respond. At lunch, the atmosphere was strained. Conversations were quieter, more guarded. My mother laughed too loudly at a joke that wasn't funny. My sister checked her phone repeatedly, jaw tight. I watched them with a strange mix of familiarity and distance. I had seen this pattern before, just never from this angle. Control maintained through momentum. When momentum stalled, anxiety surfaced. After lunch, a key item came up again, a request for confirmation that would attach responsibility clearly and publicly. The consultant looked directly at me this time. "Can you confirm your role on this?" he asked. The room went still. I felt the weight of it not as fear, but as gravity. This was the line. The place where saying yes would close the door behind me. I said, "I'm not comfortable confirming that today." There it was. No explanation, no justification, just a boundary. The consultant nodded slowly. "We'll need to revisit this," he said. My mother's face flushed just slightly. She leaned toward the consultant, began to speak, then stopped. For the first time, she didn't know how to redirect without exposing something. The meeting wrapped up with polite uncertainty. Nothing resolved. Nothing signed. People gathered their things, murmuring softly. As we stood to leave, my mother turned to me, her voice low and urgent. "What are you doing?" I met her eyes, taking care of myself. My sister looked at me, then really looked, confusion flickering across her face. This wasn't part of the script. In the elevator down, no one spoke. The silence was thick, uncomfortable. My father stared at the floor numbers lighting up one by one. Outside, my mother finally broke. "You blindsided us," she said. I shook my head. "I asked for information." "This is not how family behaves," she snapped. I paused, choosing my words carefully. "Family doesn't put each other at risk without consent." Her mouth opened, then closed. She turned away, signaling the end of the conversation. We parted in the parking lot, the separation abrupt and awkward. I got into my car and sat for a moment before starting the engine, letting my hands rest on the steering wheel. I felt lighter than I expected. Not triumphant. Just unburdened. On the drive home, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages from my sister, from my father, from my mother. I didn't read them yet. I wanted to hold the quiet a little longer. By the time I reached my apartment, dusk had settled. I turned off the car and sat there, breathing evenly. The event was over, but the consequences were just beginning. Inside, I kicked off my shoes and set my bag down. The familiar space welcomed me unchanged. I poured a glass of water and stood by the window, watching the city lights come on. They knew now that I knew something. They didn't know how much. Uncertainty had entered the space where confidence once lived. That was enough for today. I set my phone face down on the counter and let the silence stretch, knowing the next conversation would not be gentle and that I was finally ready for it. By the next morning, the quiet had been replaced by a different kind of noise, not loud, not chaotic, but persistent. My phone kept lighting up the screen, flashing my family's names like a row of doors I was expected to open. I made coffee first. I let myself do normal things in a normal order because I knew what was waiting on the other side of those messages. Pressure disguised as concern. Control disguised as love. When I finally picked up the phone, the first voicemail was from my father. His voice was soft, careful, the way it got when he was trying not to choose a side. "Call me back, okay? Your mom is upset. We just need to talk this through." Talk this through meant put things back the way they were. The next voicemail was from my mother. Her tone was clipped, controlled, and underneath it I could hear something I rarely heard from her. Fear. "You made us look unprepared. You embarrassed me. Call me today." Then a string of texts from Lillian. "Why would you do that? Everyone noticed. Mom is freaking out. You're going to ruin everything if you keep acting like this." Ruin everything. Not endanger me. Not clarify responsibility. Everything. The image. The momentum. The story. I set the phone down and stared at my coffee mug, watching the steam curl upward. The strange thing was that I didn't feel guilt the way I used to. I felt a steady clarity, like my body had finally accepted something my mind had been resisting for years. Their discomfort was not my emergency. Still, I wasn't careless. I knew what kind of people I was dealing with, not monsters, not villains in a movie, but humans who had built a life around being right. People like that don't change because someone asks nicely. They change when the structure forces them to. I opened my laptop and reviewed my notes again, not because I needed more proof, but because I needed to stay grounded in facts. Emotional conversations would come. They always did. Facts were my anchor. Around noon, my mother called again. I watched her name vibrate across the screen and let it ring twice before answering. "Hello," I said. "So you can answer now," she snapped. I kept my voice calm. I was in the middle of something earlier. "You always have something," she said. "That's not what this is about. What happened yesterday was unacceptable." I waited. I had learned that when my mother was angry, silence made her reveal more. "You made it seem like we were hiding something." She continued her words, careful now, as if she realized she was being recorded by her own tone. "You made people question our professionalism." I took a breath. I asked for clarification before confirming responsibility. That's normal. It wasn't normal to her. Not when control was the goal. "You know how these things work," she said. "You know we needed a united front." There it was. United front. The phrase that always meant sacrifice your truth for our appearance. I said I needed to understand what I was being asked to confirm. Her voice sharpened. "You're not being asked to do anything harmful. You're being asked to support your family." Support. The word that had carried so much weight for so long. The word that had made me feel noble while I was being used. I didn't argue. I said, "Send me the documents you want me to review." There was a pause, just long enough to register. "We already sent what you needed," she said. I kept my voice even. "Then send them again." Her breath came out hard. "This isn't a courtroom," she said. "You're acting like we're strangers." No, I thought. I'm acting like I'm someone who deserves consent. Out loud, I said, I'm acting like someone who reads what she agrees to. My mother's voice dropped into something colder. "You're being disloyal." That word hit the way it was meant to, sharp and personal. Disloyal was the family label for anyone who stopped making things easy. I felt the old reflex twitch. The urge to explain, to soothe, to promise I wasn't trying to hurt anyone. I noticed it and let it pass. I said, "I'm not discussing this over the phone. If you want me involved, I need everything in writing." Her silence was loud. Finally, she said, "We'll talk later," and hung up. Later again. Always later. Later was her way of keeping power without giving information. Minutes after that call ended, Lillian texted me. "I need you to stop. You're making Mom look bad. People are calling me asking questions." I stared at the message, not with anger but with something like sadness. My sister's world had always been built on being admired. Questions felt like an attack. I replied, "I'm not trying to make anyone look bad. I'm trying to protect myself." She texted back immediately. "Protect yourself from what? We're your family." The sentence would have worked on me a year ago. Family. Like a blanket you're supposed to wrap yourself in no matter how heavy it gets. I typed, "I'm protecting myself from being responsible for things I never agreed to." Her reply came slower. "You're being dramatic." Dramatic. Another label. The one used when facts were inconvenient. I set the phone down and stared out my window, watching a delivery truck crawl down the street. Ordinary life continued while my family tried to pull me back into the role that kept them comfortable. The pressure didn't stop. Over the next day, calls came from relatives. Gentle voices asking if I was okay, if something was wrong, if I had misunderstood what was happening. Their concern was real, but it carried the echo of my mother's narrative, the version where I was confused, stressed, overreacting. I kept my responses simple. I said I needed time. I said I wasn't signing anything without reviewing it. I said everything was fine. Fine was my shield now, not theirs. That evening, my father showed up at my apartment. He had texted first asking if he could come by. I didn't say no. Part of me still hoped for something from him. Not rescue, just honesty. When he walked in, he looked older than he had at the restaurant's shoulders, heavier eyes, tired. He glanced around my apartment as if he expected to find signs of chaos, then sat on the edge of my couch, hands clasped. "Your mom is scared," he said quietly. I sat across from him, keeping my posture relaxed. I didn't want this to become emotional theater. Scared of what I asked. He hesitated. Of things falling apart, of people talking, of consequences. Consequences. The word hung in the room like smoke. I nodded slowly. "I'm scared too," I said, "but not of people talking." He looked at me, confusion flickering. I said, "I'm scared of being held responsible for something I didn't agree to. And I've seen enough to know that's a possibility." His face tightened. "What have you seen?" There it was. The moment I could spill everything. The moment I could force him to stand in truth. I chose restraint. Not because I was protecting them, but because I was protecting the process. I said enough to know I need clarity. Enough to know yesterday wasn't a misunderstanding. My father's mouth opened, then closed. He looked down at his hands. For a long time he said nothing. Finally he said, "Your mother always believed she was doing what was best." "Best for whom?" I asked softly. He flinched, the question landing where he didn't want it to. He looked up, eyes wet but still guarded. "I didn't realize it felt like this to you," he said. I swallowed, feeling the grief rise like a tide. "It didn't feel like this, Dad. It was like this." He rubbed his forehead. "Your sister doesn't understand. She thinks you're trying to punish her." I shook my head. "I'm not trying to punish anyone. I'm trying to stop being used as a buffer." The word buffer seemed to hit him. He sat back, breathing out slowly. "So what do you want?" he asked. The question sounded sincere, but it also sounded like someone hoping for a simple answer, something he could carry back to my mother like a peace offering. I said, "I want the truth. I want everything in writing. I want to know what my name is attached to. And I want the freedom to say no without being treated like I'm betraying anyone." My father's eyes dropped again. He nodded slowly, as if he understood, but his silence told me he didn't know how to give me what I was asking for. When he left, he hugged me awkwardly, lingering a little too long. "Be careful," he whispered, and then he was gone. Be careful. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I'll fix it." Be careful. I locked the door behind him and leaned my forehead against it, letting the weight settle. I wasn't angry at him. I was tired of his softness. Softness can be another form of harm when it protects the wrong person. Over the next few days, the pressure shifted into something sharper. My mother's texts became less about discussion and more about directives. "We need you to sign. We need you to confirm. This has to be handled." Her language was urgent now, stripped of sweetness. And then the outside world moved closer. An email arrived from someone I didn't recognize. At first, a professional address, polite language, requesting a follow-up meeting to clarify roles and documentation. The same consultant from the event looping in a legal contact. My stomach tightened, not with fear but with inevitability. The structure was pulling itself into the open. I stared at the email for a long moment, then forwarded it to myself again. Saved it, filed it. I did not respond immediately. I wanted to choose my timing, not react to theirs. That night, Lillian called. Her voice was frantic, sharper than I'd ever heard it. "What did you do?" she demanded. "Why are they emailing you? Mom says you're making things worse." I closed my eyes, letting her panic wash over me without taking it in. I said I didn't make anything worse. I stopped pretending everything was fine. She inhaled sharply. "You're going to destroy the business," she said. "The business. Not me." I opened my eyes and stared at the dark window, my reflection faintly visible. I said if the truth can destroy it, then it wasn't stable to begin with. She went silent. In that silence, I felt the point of no return. They couldn't spin this away anymore. They couldn't blame my emotions or my mood. The process had begun, and it didn't require my cooperation to move forward. The next confrontation wouldn't happen in my mother's living room or over the phone. It would happen where facts mattered, where records existed, where charm had less power. I set my phone down and breathed evenly, feeling fear flicker at the edges, then settle into something steadier. I wasn't going to manage this for them. I wasn't going to rescue the narrative. I was going to let truth stand on its own, and I was going to stand with it. When I finally replied to the email, my hands were steady. I asked for a meeting date. And I understood with a clarity that felt like cold water that the next room I walked into would be the one where the story changed for good. The building where we met had no warmth to it. Glass, steel, neutral colors meant to keep emotion out of the room. I arrived early, not out of nerves, but habit. I wanted time to settle into the space, to let my breathing slow before anyone else arrived. The conference room was already prepared. Long table, bottled water set at even intervals, a legal pad at each seat. It felt deliberate, impartial, the opposite of every family conversation I had ever had about responsibility. Here words mattered. Here assumptions didn't count for much. When my mother walked in, she paused for half a second when she saw me. She recovered quickly, smoothing her jacket, lifting her chin. My sister followed close behind, eyes darting, confident, strained, but still present. My father came last, quieter than usual, his steps slower. We took our seats. I chose one near the end of the table, not distancing myself, not positioning myself at the center. I wanted to be visible, not dominant. The consultant from the event was there, along with a lawyer I didn't recognize. Polite introductions were made. Everyone smiled in the way people do when they know this isn't a social call. The lawyer began by outlining the purpose of the meeting, language careful and neutral. Clarification, documentation, alignment of roles, words designed to keep things calm. My mother nodded along, her expression composed. She spoke when it was her turn, voice smooth, confident, explaining the structure as she always had. She framed decisions as collective responsibilities, as shared outcomes, as intentional. She spoke of trust and family, of long-standing arrangements that had worked well until recently. I listened without interrupting, hands folded loosely in front of me. I had learned that silence can be more unsettling than argument. When my sister spoke, she leaned into the narrative my mother had set. She emphasized her involvement, her learning curve, her dedication. She avoided specifics, focusing instead on intent and effort. My father added little, just enough to appear cooperative. The lawyer nodded, then asked a simple question, one that shifted the room without raising his voice. Can we clarify who agreed to assume specific liabilities outlined in these documents? The air changed. My mother's eyes flicked toward me automatically. It was instinctive, a reflex born of years of directing weight my way. She caught herself and looked back at the lawyer. We've always handled these things internally, she said. The lawyer smiled politely. I understand. But for our purposes, we need to know who consented and how. Silence stretched. I felt the pull then, the familiar pressure to fill the gap, to make things easier, to smooth the moment. It rose and fell like a wave and passed. I spoke calmly. I didn't agree to assume those liabilities. The words landed without drama. No accusation, no raised voice. Just a statement. My sister turned to me, eyes wide. What are you talking about? I kept my gaze on the lawyer. I was not informed that my name was being attached in that way, and I did not consent with full understanding. My mother's face tightened. That's not accurate, she said quickly. You were aware. We discussed this. I shook my head slightly. We discussed paperwork in general terms, not risk allocation, not responsibility. The lawyer leaned forward slightly. Do you have documentation that reflects your understanding at the time? I opened my folder and slid a copy of the document across the table. Not dramatically, just enough that it could be read. This is the draft I was sent, I said. It lists obligations under my name without explanation or discussion. My mother inhaled sharply. That was preliminary. I met her eyes for the first time. Preliminary documents still matter when they assign responsibility. The lawyer examined the page, then another, his expression thoughtful. He asked a few clarifying questions, technical ones, not emotional. I answered what I could simply factually. My sister's composure cracked. "This is ridiculous," she said. "You know you're part of this. You always have been." I turned to her then. "I have supported this family. That is not the same as consenting to carry legal or financial risk without full disclosure." She opened her mouth, then closed it, the argument she wanted not fitting the room. My father finally spoke, his voice low. "We never meant to put you in danger." I nodded. Intent does not change outcome. The lawyer shifted his attention back to my mother. "Based on this, we need to reassess role assignments. Liability cannot be assumed without informed consent." My mother's hands clenched on the table. "This is being blown out of proportion." The lawyer remained calm. "This is standard procedure." For the first time, my mother looked uncertain. Not angry. Uncertain. Her authority had always thrived in emotional spaces. Here, it had limits. The conversation moved forward in a different tone. Less narrative, more fact. Roles were examined. Language was questioned. The structure my family had relied on began to unravel, not explosively, but methodically. I sat quietly, answering when addressed, saying nothing when not. I didn't need to push. The truth did its own work. At one point, my sister turned to me, her voice tight. "Why are you doing this to us?" I looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something soften and harden at the same time. "I'm not doing this to you. I stopped doing it for you." She stared at me as if I had spoken another language. The meeting ended with clear next steps. Further review, adjustments, accountability. Nothing resolved immediately, but the direction had changed. The weight I had carried so long was being redistributed. As we stood to leave, my mother avoided my eyes. My father lingered, placing a hand on my shoulder briefly, unsure whether it was comfort or apology. Outside, the air felt colder than when I had arrived. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching my family walk ahead together, their steps quick, their conversation urgent. They didn't look back. I didn't feel victorious. I felt emptied in a good way. Like a room after furniture has been moved out, echoing but ready. On the drive home, my hands were steady on the wheel. The city moved around me, indifferent to the shift that had just occurred. I let myself feel the mix of relief and grief without judging either. I had not exposed them out of anger. I had stopped protecting them out of necessity. That mattered. When I reached my apartment, I sat in the car for a moment before going inside. I knew the fallout would continue. Conversations would follow. Accusations. Attempts to renegotiate the emotional terrain. But the reckoning had begun, and it was no longer mine to manage alone. I stepped out of the car and locked it. The sound sharp and final in the quiet evening. The next chapter wouldn't be about discovery or confrontation. It would be about what remains when the truth has nowhere left to hide. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before it. Not the sharp silence of anger or the brittle kind that waits to break, but a deep, stunned quiet that settled over everything like dust after a collapse. For the first few days, no one called. My phone stayed still on the kitchen counter while I moved through my routines. Work, groceries, laundry, ordinary life continuing as if nothing fundamental had shifted. That was the strangest part. The world did not pause for family reckoning. It rarely does. When the calls finally came, they did not come all at once. They arrived separately, cautiously, like people testing unfamiliar ground. My mother was first. Her number lit up the screen one afternoon while I was folding towels. I stared at it longer than I needed to, not because I didn't know whether to answer, but because I was curious about which version of her would show up. I answered. Her voice was controlled, measured, almost formal. "I want you to understand something," she said. "What happened in that meeting had consequences." I waited. People are asking questions now. Things didn't need to go that far. There it was. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I should have been clearer." Consequences. In her world, consequences were something that happened when control slipped. I said quietly, "They went that far long before the meeting. I just stopped carrying them alone." She exhaled sharply. "You always have to make it sound dramatic." I folded another towel, smoothing the edges. "It's not dramatic to want consent." Her silence stretched. Then she said something that felt truer than anything she'd said before. "I did what I thought was best for this family." I closed my eyes for a moment. Best is a dangerous word when it's never shared. "We didn't raise you to be like this," she added, the disappointment heavy in her voice. "Like what I asked." She hesitated. Confrontational. Difficult. I opened my eyes. "I didn't confront you. I answered questions honestly." She didn't respond to that. Instead, she said, "I need time to process all of this." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Take it." When the call ended, I stood in the quiet kitchen and let myself feel the ache that rose in my chest. Not regret, grief. For the version of my mother who might have chosen differently if she had known another way. My sister reached out next, but not with words, with silence. Days passed without a message which was louder than anything she could have said. Lillian had always used presence as currency: attention, affection, validation. Withholding it was her way of reclaiming power. When she finally texted, it was late at night. "I don't recognize you anymore." I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "You never really saw me." The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Then nothing. My father took longer. When he did come by, it wasn't announced. He showed up on a Sunday morning, knocking softly like he wasn't sure he was welcome. I opened the door and saw the same tired posture, the same careful eyes. We sat at the kitchen table without ceremony. No coffee at first. No small talk. "I should have said something sooner," he said finally. I nodded. Yes. He winced at the simplicity of it. I thought keeping the peace was the right thing. Keeping the peace for whom I asked. He rubbed his hands together, a habit I remembered from childhood. "Your mother is strong. You know that." I did. Too well. I said strength doesn't excuse harm. He looked at me, then really looked at me, and something shifted in his expression. Not defensiveness. Recognition. "I didn't know how much was being placed on you," he said. Not the way it was. I believed him. That was the hardest part. His ignorance was real. So was the damage. We sat in that truth for a while, the hum of the refrigerator filling the space. Finally, he asked, "What happens now?" I considered the question. "I don't know yet, but it doesn't go back to how it was." He nodded slowly. I figured. Outside of my family, the process moved forward without emotion. Emails, follow-ups, clarifications, professionals doing what they do when things need to be untangled. I was copied, informed, asked for input only when necessary. For the first time, responsibility was being handled where it belonged. That brought relief, but it also brought sadness. There is a quiet grief that comes when you realize how much could have been avoided if honesty had been chosen earlier. I grieved without regret. I grieved the dinners where I smiled instead of speaking. The conversations I softened to avoid tension. The parts of myself I set aside because they made others uncomfortable. But I did not regret stopping. As the weeks passed, the power dynamics shifted in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. My phone stopped buzzing with requests. No one assumed I would fix things. No one dropped problems at my feet disguised as favors. Silence replaced entitlement. Lillian tried once more weeks later, showing up unannounced at my door. She looked different without her usual polished hair pulled back, eyes rimmed red. "You didn't have to do it like that," she said, the accusation brittle. I leaned against the counter, arms crossed loosely. "Like what?" "In public. In front of everyone." I held her gaze. "You put me in public positions for years without asking. You just didn't like what happened this time." Her mouth trembled. "Everything is falling on me now." I let the words sit between us. That's what accountability feels like when it's new. She looked away, angry and frightened all at once. "You could have protected me." I shook my head. "I already did. For years. That's why this hurts." She left without another word, the door closing softly behind her. I didn't chase her. Love doesn't always mean pursuit. My mother tested the boundary one last time. She called, her voice controlled, wounded pride threaded through every word. "Families don't air their issues like that," she said. I responded calmly. "Families also don't assign risk in secret." She said, "I don't know how we come back from this." I answered honestly, "We don't come back. We move forward differently. Or we don't move together." That conversation ended quietly, without resolution, and for once, that was enough. I began to notice how my body felt without constant vigilance, how my shoulders rested lower, how sleep came easier, how decisions felt simpler when they weren't filtered through imagined reactions. I was no longer waiting for permission to exist fully. One evening, sitting alone on my balcony watching the city lights flicker on, I reflected on how strange it was that choosing myself felt so radical. How deeply I had been trained to equate self-sacrifice with love. I understood now that boundaries are not punishments. They are instructions. They tell people how to treat you if they want access to your life. Some of my family members would learn that. Some wouldn't. Both outcomes were survivable. The story I had lived for so long was no longer the one I was telling myself. I was not the fixer, not the buffer, not the quiet solution to other people's problems. I was simply a person who deserved clarity and respect. As the night deepened, I went inside and turned off the lights, the apartment settling around me. Tomorrow would come with its own choices, its own challenges. But this part was over. I was no longer reacting to what they did. I was choosing what I would carry, and for the first time the weight felt like mine to set down. Peace didn't arrive all at once. It came in small, ordinary moments that surprised me by how light they felt. Waking up without a knot in my chest. Answering the phone without rehearsing my tone. Making plans without calculating how they might ripple through someone else's expectations. I didn't realize how much energy I had spent bracing myself until I stopped doing it. The weeks after the meeting settled into a new rhythm. Emails from the consultants tapered off as roles were clarified and reassigned. My name appeared less and less then, only where it belonged. Responsibility moved back to the people who had always assumed it would never touch them. My family adjusted unevenly. My father called occasionally, conversations gentler now, more tentative. He asked about my work, my apartment, small things that didn't carry an agenda. Sometimes he apologized in fragments, not full confessions, but acknowledgments. I took them as they were. Healing doesn't require perfection to begin. My mother kept her distance. When she did reach out, her words were careful, measured, as if she were navigating unfamiliar terrain. She spoke of logistics, not feelings. That was her way of maintaining dignity when control was no longer absolute. I stopped waiting for something different from her. That expectation had been the quiet ache underneath everything. Letting it go felt like setting down a weight I'd carried so long I thought it was part of my body. Lillian drifted in and out of my life like a tide, unsure of its own direction. Sometimes she was defensive. sometimes oddly subdued. Once over coffee, she admitted she hadn't realized how much had been shielded from her. Another time, she accused me of making things harder than they needed to be. Both could be true. Our relationship didn't snap back into place, but it didn't disappear either. It changed shape. Less performance, more pauses, fewer assumptions. I learned to live with that. What surprised me most was how the story I told myself changed. For years, I had believed my value lay in being useful, in smoothing rough edges, in making sure everyone else landed softly. I had called that love. Now I understood it had been a transaction I never negotiated. Choosing myself didn't make me colder. It made me clearer. I laughed more easily. I slept better. I trusted my instincts again, the ones I had muted for so long because they complicated things. One afternoon, months later, I passed the restaurant where it had all cracked open. The windows glowed warmly, diners leaning close to each other, unaware of the private dramas that could unfold at any table. I paused for a moment on the sidewalk, watching reflections move across the glass. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more enduring. Closure. Not the kind that wraps everything up neatly, but the kind that lets you walk past a memory without flinching. Inside that restaurant, I had finally said no out loud. Outside it, I had learned how to keep saying it without shouting. I went on with my life in ways that would have seemed impossible before. I made decisions based on what felt right, not what would keep the peace. I said yes when I wanted to. I said no when I needed to. I stopped explaining myself to people who heard explanations as invitations to negotiate. The world did not end. In fact, it widened. Sometimes late at night, I thought about the younger version of myself, the one who smiled through discomfort, the one who paid the bill and swallowed the story that came with it. I wished I could reach back and tell her that love is not proven by endurance, that respect is not something you earn by disappearing. But maybe she had to walk through all of it to get here. If you're listening to this, and something in it feels familiar, if you've ever been praised for being easy while quietly paying the cost, I want you to know this. You are not selfish for wanting fairness. You are not disloyal for asking questions. And you are not cruel for choosing yourself. Boundaries are not walls. They are doors. They show people how to enter your life with care. Some will refuse to learn. Some will step back. Some will surprise you. All of that is survivable. What isn't survivable is living your whole life as the silent solution to other people's problems. I didn't get revenge in the way movies promise. There was no dramatic downfall, no applause, no instant transformation. What I got was something quieter and far more powerful. My life back. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever stood at a table feeling unseen while everyone else waited for you to pay, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your experience in the comments. Stay with the channel for more stories like this. And remember, you're not alone in learning how to choose yourself.